Now, in the previous class, I already spoke a bit about the differences between modernized societies and those who have not yet gone through that process, and how that affects families as a whole. The proper term for this is a pre-industrial society in which people sustain themselves in a non-industrialized manner. Agriculture, hunting, gathering, or a combination of all those. And as such, there was little to no surplus at all. This was a subsistence economy. People created or found enough to subsist on, and that was it. And everybody's efforts were needed in order to survive, so society was much more egalitarian in nature. Now, that doesn't mean that men did everything there was to do and that women did everything there was to do. Not at all. The fact is that a female body can gestate a child and give birth and a male's cannot, and this directly affects the division of labor. Now, I feel like I should insert a joke here, as women sometimes do, about men not being able to handle labor pain. Maybe you've seen videos online of men attached to electrodes that are supposed to simulate labor pain and have laughed at them freaking out. The point is, because of that fact, because of the need for children to be born and to care for them, especially when they're young, which includes nourishment or breastfeeding, and because only the female body can do that, at least part of women's work was different from men's. But the contribution of women in pre-industrial societies was considered equally important as that as men. And that's really significant, that the work that women did was truly equally valued. Now, your text goes into quite a bit of detail regarding how family life evolved in early societies, and I'm going to highlight the main points from a sociological perspective. The first is, why did things change? Why are we not all continuing to live in the same way that humans did at the beginning of time? Because human beings figured out how to create a surplus instead of living hand to mouth, instead of never having anything extra to rely on. Once humans established agricultural or horticultural societies, this meant two things. They were able to create a surplus of food, and that they could sustain a larger group of people in one place. To us, this seems not even worth commenting on, because it's such a simple fact. But at the same time, these were really significant evolutionary changes for the species as a whole, and they were really important first steps for the development of what would eventually be families as we know them. If you think of all the functions a family performs now, this was the beginning of that at the most basic and simple level. This was the beginning of these functions becoming the norm. And this is important. This was also the beginning of tracing descent and kinship. That's important. Now, did people at the time think of it that way? Probably not. They probably thought of it in a much more simple way. That's the plot of land I've cultivated for many years. I want that to be taken over by my own offspring so they can benefit from what I've accomplished instead of somebody who's not as close to me. Simple as that. But on even a more basic level, I've grown something to eat, I have extra, I want my own offspring and those close to me to have it, not somebody else. So this was not just a social arrangement, the way things were, whatever way you want to phrase it. This was also relevant for the basic survival of a family in the earliest societies. And of particular interest to a sociologist, this was the beginning of inequality in society, because some people had more and some people had less. And when a family member gave their surplus to somebody else, when a family member had something passed on to them, this would increase inequality. So I'm talking about family groups thousands of years ago. This is how far back we can go in history and still see families performing certain basic functions. Thousands of years before North America was colonized and thousands of years before industrialization was occurred. Now, if we take a really big jump ahead in time, proceeding to early European life, Still, hundreds of years ago, by that point, social stratification had firmly evolved. So not only were there differences between people, who had more and who had less, an actual class structure had evolved. By the time we reach early European life, class position was a determining feature of your life, of your family life. Even more so than your gender, even more so than if you were male or female. The class structure was extremely important, and whatever class you belonged to determined your life in most ways. Communities that were settled had grown substantially. The importance of kinship and inheritance had grown substantially. And this was firmly patrilineal in nature, specifically favoring the eldest son. So a system of land ownership emerged in which it was pretty standard to have large tracts of land owned by one family who were part of the upper classes that were worked by the lower classes. And you have to remember, at this general point in history, life expectancy was quite short compared to what it is now. If you talked about reaching old age at that time, that meant reaching 45. There was a very high rate of mortality in all ways: infant mortality, childhood mortality, maternal mortality, etc. People didn't live as long, and there were many more things they could die from. Looking at families specifically, children were not perceived in the same manner they are now. So, right now we talk about childhood as a distinct period of life, but at that time it was nothing special. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for children to be treated and thought of pretty poorly by today's standards. Now, of all the societies I've mentioned so far, all of them were pre-industrial societies, obviously because none of them were industrialized. Then we come to pre-industrial Canada and the United States. Now, again, your text specifically refers to the US, but much of what it says applies to Canada as well. As you've likely studied in many ways throughout your education, colonialism completely changed the map of the world. No, Christopher Columbus did not discover America, and neither did anybody else, because there were already a lot of people there who had been there for thousands of years. There were millions of people who would eventually be referred to as Indians. And although it's common to refer to indigenous groups as one big whole, it's important to point out that all indigenous groups are not the same, each is unique. Absolutely, there is variation. And it's very patronizing when people talk about all indigenous tribes like they were all the same. Now, for First Nations, their family groups were the basis of everything in society. All economic organization was based on family participation and production. All of one's community life was centered around family groups. All of one's social life was centered around their family. And the community's spiritual and social life as a whole were dependent on these family units. So you can see, looking at the slide here, are estimates for how many indigenous people were in the US and Canada, and how many there ended up being a fairly short number of years later. In regards to marriage, there were various marriage patterns. Some tribes practiced polygamy, others were monogamous. There were hundreds of different languages. There were different patterns of residence, different methods of supporting the tribe and one's family. Some were based on patrilineal descent, some on matrilineal. In some, women held much more power and authority than they ever did or have since in other groups. Family size was not usually very large because of high mortality rates, but when children were born, they were welcome and celebrated. Looking at colonial life in North America, we actually have quite a bit of information to refer to. I should have gone ahead with my slide. So yeah, women married at a younger age at that time with indigenous groups. But that was not uncommon for several ethnic groups at that time. Sometimes marriages were organized by the family or tribe, but again, this was more common for society overall at that time. So we can't just refer to all Indigenous groups, to all First Nations people in what is now known as North America in the same manner, because that would be completely incorrect. Then we proceed to colonial life in North America. And just as in our previous class, when I said I was beginning the discussion with a discussion of marriage, because ideally that's supposed to be the starting point of a family, here I'm going to do the same, but before you get married, you have to meet somebody. So I'm going to start with a discussion of courtship. Courtship and dating are two completely different things, even though our modern minds like to think of the terms interchangeably. The main difference between courtship and dating is that courtship occurs with the express purpose of finding a marriage partner. That is the reason, the only reason why you would spend time with somebody. That's why you would get to know them, to see if you would be suitable for each other for marriage. Dating is different. It's much more casual. There's an emphasis on having fun. And marriage is not the express end goal. During colonial times, there was absolutely no casual dating of any kind, in any way. It didn't even exist as a concept. And when courting, not dating, your parents would have a great deal of input regarding who courted who. The father especially would have had the final say. And this was in regard to sons as well as daughters, even though we tend to only think of daughters as being subject to parental control. Now, does this mean that everybody who was young did what their parents wanted them to do? Of course not. There's always been some people who do not do what's expected of them, no matter how strict regulations or expectations are, and no matter what the consequences would be if they were caught. You know, we could probably have a big philosophical discussion about this, and whether this is just part of human nature at a certain age to want to do what you want to do instead of doing what your parents tell you. With this in mind, as indicated in your text, it's estimated that up to 1/3 of young women who were married at this time were pregnant. And you know, I had to laugh at that a bit. I'll tell you a personal story about it. It used to be very, very common for families to have a family Bible. And within this family Bible, there would be pages specifically dedicated to recording marriages, deaths, and births, to record your own family history. Over 25 years ago, I was looking at ours and I noticed that the marriage date and the birth date of my great-great-great-grandmother did not exactly match up, and the gap was too big for it to have just been a premature baby. So I called my granny at the time and I told her what I noticed and the dates, and she immediately said, well, that makes sense because my great-great-great-grandmother had been such a sweet lady that everybody loved, and my great-great-great-grandfather was a nasty person that everybody hated. So that explained why they got married. And you know, at first I thought, you know, wow, that's kind of funny. My great-great-great-grandmother maybe had a bit of a wild streak in her. And then I thought, that really isn't funny at all, because she had to spend her whole life with somebody she ended up not even liking very much, who was difficult and by all accounts was a mean person. Casual sex is much more common now. Can we truly imagine what it would have been like if people ended up marrying somebody they had a casual relationship with because they literally had no choice? And then I had to laugh a bit when the text describes bundling, the practice of a young man being allowed to spend the night, albeit with a piece of wood between them to keep any hanky-panky from occurring. And he did this with the girl he was courting because there was so much distance between families that he often had to travel. And all I could think of when I read this was, seriously? And I'll say that again. Seriously? Feel free to call me a suspicious pessimist, but yeah, I think that contributed to the high number of young girls who were pregnant when they got married. In any event, in early Canadian and American colonial society, settlers truly, in every sense of the word, really relied on their family unit for survival, and the nuclear family dominated that society. It was the backbone of society. Coming to North America as a settler, you would in fact be more reliant on your family here than in your country of origin, because you had to be. Your family was all you had. As you all know, in the early days of our country, it was very sparsely populated. It was the norm to be pretty isolated from others. So your family was truly the only people you had you could rely on for everything. And I do mean rely on no matter what your age was, so that adults did rely on children to assist with everything and depended on them as workers, usually full-time. It really isn't possible to overstate how important this family unit was at this time as a unit of production, not as a unit of consumption, which occurred much later. This was pre-industrialization, and the family was an economic unit of production. Every single family member was expected to contribute. They were expected to contribute in some way, no matter their gender or how young they were. All family members worked the family farm as hard as the adults did, maybe at different jobs, slightly more suitable to their age, but with just as much effort. And this was necessary. So again, a family was a unit of production. I'm going to say that again. At the same time as being a distinct unit of economic production, family was also a unit of reproduction. Having as many children as possible was extremely important for very specific reasons. As stated, the economic structure necessitated married couples had a lot of kids to work the farm with them. Think of it like producing your own labor force. So the economic structure encouraged procreation. It was also considered a religious duty to procreate as much as possible, to accept as many children as God deemed you should have. And religion was one of the main linchpins holding society together, acting as the basis of society, dictating norms and standards. So religion had an extremely strong effect on family structure. It's estimated that in Canada, in 1851, the total fertility rate per woman was about 7. That women's age at first birth was on average 25, and her average age on last birth was about 35. So each married woman had on average 6 to 7 children, and these estimated figures tell us that women spent those years between their mid-20s and their mid-30s either pregnant or wrestling with newborns. So I want you to imagine what daily life was like, not only for the women in question, but also the family dynamic overall, geared towards children and work exclusively. And the fact that infants and children died fairly often, especially under age 5, gave a husband and wife another reason to simply continue having as many children as possible, to ensure they would have a strong economic unit in the form of children to work alongside them, and in the form of adult children to look after them in old age. Now, the infant mortality rate is calculated by dividing the number of infants who die within 1 year of birth by the number of infants who are born. And this is usually expressed as the ratio of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. So this doesn't include stillbirths. Now, since record keeping in the 1700s and 1800s is not what it is today, it's difficult to have really specific stats regarding infant mortality at that time. But we can estimate that it was 200 infant deaths per 1,000 live births in some areas. So that means, on average, 20% of all infants born would die within 1 year. Whether you personally have children or not right now, maybe you have younger siblings or nieces or nephews. But even if you don't have a baby in your family right now, I think we can all understand that's a very high number, and it's heartbreaking on a number of levels. And when an infant died, everybody, mother and father and everybody, needed to just keep going. It's not like today when you could take time off work, see a therapist, whatever. The realities of life at that time necessitated simply continuing on and doing so immediately. Even after infancy, the first 5 years of life were perilous for a child, and that's not being dramatic. Various things in society affected infant and child mortality at the time, things that for us in this time probably wouldn't even occur to us. For a child born in 1851, their life expectancy at birth was 43. But if they could make it to 15, there was a greater likelihood of living longer. And when an infant was born, from the moment they were born, their family life was in many ways dictated by religion. The concept of original sin is a part of Christianity. It states that by simply being born, an infant inherits a tainted nature and an inclination for sinful conduct. Now, in traditional Christian teaching, original sin is the result of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God when they ate a forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. So in Genesis 3, it contains a line that says, and this is direct quote, "I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me," end quote. So simply, original sin says that everyone is born sinful. And they're born with a built-in urge to do bad things and to disobey God. So even infants and children needed to be guided appropriately, including very strict discipline and a very strong religious upbringing. Now, what was considered appropriate for children to do then was very different than our ideas now. So kids then may have done what we would now consider hard labor or something we'd consider dangerous. And they would have worked long hours, often as long as the adults. But at that time, it was a societal and social norm, and it was simply expected. And again, necessary for economic survival of one's family unit. The idea that childhood is a unique time in life that necessitates special attention and care was not even considered yet. So children in rural parts of the country worked on farms alongside the grown-ups just as hard as the adults did. A boy's tasks might include cutting, splitting, or carrying firewood for the stove or fireplace, tending the farm animals, carrying water to the house, putting up or repairing fencing, working in the gardens, the fields, the orchards, hunting, trapping, fishing, that kind of thing. Girls had equally long days spent cooking, milking cows and goats, collecting eggs, churning butter, making breads and cheeses, preserving foods, cleaning, doing laundry, making candles, sewing clothes for the family, preparing fibers like wool and flax to spin and weave. And when we read about this, we most often picture kids working on the family farm. But they might even have been hired out for a wage, maybe to another farm that needed laborers. Or in less rural areas, children as young as 6 or 8 years old might run errands and make deliveries for a storekeeper. They may be apprenticed to a skilled craftsman, or they could be hired out as a servant full time. So your 8-year-old daughter would work full time as a maid, or your 10-year-old son would work full time as a stable boy. And then in addition, children as young as 6 might care for younger brothers and sisters or help older family members. Again, full time, being truly responsible for them. And this was necessary for a family's economic survival. Not just to get ahead, but often for their survival, often so that the family could eat. Because the overall death rate was so high, and because women more commonly died in childbirth, it was common for a widow or a widower to remarry and not to wait very long to do so. You know, if you're ever in an older graveyard, you'll see many graves for women under age 30, and there's often an infant or toddler being buried with them. If it's an infant, this means she probably died in childbirth or complications from childbirth. And if it's a young child, it means they probably contracted the same illness. So remembering that families are economic units of production at this time, if a husband or wife should die, this would not only be sad for obvious reasons, it also completely disrupted the family's ability to remain economically viable. So that remarriage was in many ways a necessity to ensure survival, and that's not overstating it. What were marriages generally like between a husband and a wife? Well, every marriage is different, just like it is now. Every married couple has their own way of doing things that they've worked out between them. But we can still make some accurate general observations about marriage at this time. Yes, the work of both the husband and wife was necessary to keep the family unit economically viable. But colonial North American society was very patriarchal in nature. Women were necessary, but men were in charge. Male authority was dominant and recognized and supported in wider society, which thus supported it in the home. And you know, we could probably laugh at this in class, comment on how ridiculous that is, but the reality is that women at the time were considered inferior to men physically and morally, and this was 100% supported by the church, which was a dominant institution in society. Now, if we look at slavery, yes, slavery was practiced in Canada, not just the United States. Although it's the US most people immediately think of in regards to slavery. And Canada did not construct its entire economic structure based on slavery as the South did in the US. Generally, we think of the social situation of African Americans as an issue for the US, don't we? I don't remember ever learning about slavery in Canada in the 70s in the elementary school system. It simply wasn't taught. I remember learning about how slaves in the US would travel to Canada via the Underground Railroad to escape their horrible situation there. It never occurred to me in elementary school or junior high school that slavery occurred here, even though slaves were indeed bought and sold in Canada until at least the 1820s. It was in the early 17th century that colonizers in New France first began the practice of chattel slavery, which means people were considered to be personal property that could be bought and sold, traded, or inherited. There were approximately 4,200 slaves in New France at the height of slavery in Canada, and about 2,700 of those were First Nations people. About 1,400 were black. So slave owning was not unusual in colonial Canada early on, and individuals from all levels of society might own slaves, not just the rich, not just the political elite. They might be owned by government officials, military officials, merchants, fur traders, tradespeople, even religious people like priests or bishops. Just as they did in the US, slaves here fulfilled the need for cheap labor. Simple as that. Absolutely, they were depended on for economic growth, so they would be used in the business of their owner. Maybe building log homes or chopping wood, clearing land. Maybe in a butcher shop or a tavern or an inn. Maybe as agricultural workers preparing fields or planting or harvesting or tending to livestock. They might be trained to be a blacksmith or carpenter or cobbler. Many slaves were also put to work as hunters, voyageurs, fishermen, dock workers. They were used to make a variety of products like soap, candles, bricks, sails, ropes. A slave might also be hired out to somebody as a way for the owner to earn more money on their investment. So there were legal contracts that detailed who was bought or sold by whom. And in a person's will, slaves could be handed down. Whatever a slave was tasked with doing, they worked long hours and were always at the beck and call of their masters. Now, there also seems to be a persistent myth that in Canada, people who were enslaved were treated substantially better than slaves in the US, but that's not true. Since simply being African American was considered less than human, their treatment in Canada was comparable to that further south. They were chattel. They had no freedom and no rights. They were either treated more humanely or cruelly, depending on the kind of master they had. But the mere fact that they were considered property sums up their overall social condition and position in society. So yes, slavery in Canada was not as widespread as in the US. It did not persist in the same manner. It did not contribute to a civil war in Canada. Almost the entire economy of the southern US was based on plantation agriculture and almost completely dependent on slave labor. And yes, as both countries progressed and developed, Canada was the goal for slaves who managed to escape. Now, England banned slavery in 1833, which is just under 30 years before the Civil War began in the US. And yes, the Underground Railroad brought tens of thousands of fugitive slaves to Canada. There is a very sizable community of Black Canadians in Nova Scotia and southern Ontario who can trace their ancestry to American slaves who used the Underground Railroad to flee from the United States. And it's estimated that anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 managed to make it to Canada.